going to be discussing, as part of this episode, the major challenges and problems we face in terms of communication in India. Communication is for education. Communication is for information. Communication exists in a context. To overcome any kind of a barrier, we need to understand the context in which communication is taking place. In that kind of a context, we also need to get to know some understanding about the purpose of communication. Communication is a powerful weapon, and communication is an instrument for social change. Communication plays a role in attitude change and behavior. And when we are talking about communication, the context in which communication is taking place has to be understood. There are several challenges, or barriers, or obstacles we face in the process of communicating. The barriers have got to be perceived in relation to Indian society and its people. Indian society is a very diversified, plural society. Its audiences are quite varied in the sense of culture, varied in the sense of language, and they come from different kinds of social and economic backgrounds. And that is where it is important for any communicator to understand to whom are we communicating, who are the audience, what is their social, economic, cultural, linguistics, educational background. As long as we do not have an understanding about the target audience for whom we are communicating, it is difficult to overcome communication barriers. Let us now talk about one of the major problems that we face in this country in terms of barriers to communication, or communication problems. Let me identify what are these factors. 1. Credibility of the message, lack of awareness of rural areas. Number 3, lack of adequate communication tools. And number 4, lack of motivation among people. Number 5, lack of adequate mobility. Number 6, too large clientele. Number 7, there is more concentration on the needs of particular section of people and neglecting some other sections. And a very important factor, inadequate feedback. Let me try to explain this a little more in detail. What are the major communication problems we face in this country? All communication must have credibility. If there is no credibility or no credibility, people are not going to be accepting your message. We must have an understanding about rural people, rural masses. We have to have a total understanding about the geographical area in which we are communicating. We must know the area in which we are communicating, because communication is geographic specific and area specific. And we must also ensure whether they have all the communication media which are available. What kind of a media need to be used in which rural context, in which urban context. Through media, we are going to be giving messages. Once we take a right decision about the nature of right media we need to use, message can be disseminated easily. We should also ensure that all people do not have the kind of a motivation we are looking for. Lack of motivation becomes another barrier to communication. Lack of interest. And we must try to ensure communication purpose itself is to motivate people and see that they are interested in our communication. And one other important factor we need to take into consideration is the process of communication is not complete. In communication, we are giving them messages, we are giving them information. Whether that information has been understood by the people, how much they have understood, has any distortion taken place anywhere, we need to ensure it. That is where another important problem we face is not collecting adequate feedback. To overcome a communication barrier, we must collect regular feedback, so that once we get to know feedback, we know what were the problems in our communication, why people have not understood, why there was some distortion in our communication messages, so that we'll be in a position to ensure next time that we communicate precisely and communicate exactly. Now, it is also important for us to look at some of the problems we face, barriers we face in terms of communication. The whole purpose of communication is to simplify communication messages. And we would like to identify some of the factors that should be kept in mind while communicating with people effectively so that we can overcome some barriers. We must ensure repetition of the message. There must be frequency of the message. It is not adequate we communicate only once. Different people hear or see or listen at different points of time. So that's where we need to ensure. A lot of research which has been carried out in this country indicates that once the frequency of the message is more, once we repeat the message more times, people understand much better. We must always try to ensure that people understand the message. The message should be comprehensive, clear and precise. And completeness of information is another important factor. Specificity of the information for the target audience. The information needs to be very specific to the target audience. Timeliness of information, relevance of information. All information should be useful to target audience. Not only ensuring the above factors, but we should also ensure the applicability of information. People should make use of that information, apply or adopt that information. And we must try to see that familiarity of the media. Familiarity of media would mean, do they have access to that media? Is that media available to them? If you are going to be writing in newspapers, is that newspaper available in that context? Do newspapers get circulated in that area? Which newspaper gets circulated in that area? We have many newspapers in this country. We have Indian language newspapers, we have English newspapers, and in languages itself. And then the important factor we need to take into consideration, the knowledge levels of the audience. The knowledge levels of the audience and the information levels of the audience are quite varied. We cannot go with an assumption that all of them have the same information levels or same understanding levels. Depending upon their level, we go about communicating. The purpose of communication is to diffuse messages, diffusion of innovation and adoption of the messages. This is a major function of communication. We are not only diffusing information, but we should also ensure adoption of messages. That is where it is important for us to identify 4 important factors. 1, compatibility of the message to the audience, communicability of the message to the audience, relevance of the message to the audience, and the 4th and a very crucial factor is the credibility of the message. I would like to identify some of the socio-economic conditions which play as the barriers in terms of communication. I would like to identify following factors. To ensure communication to be effective, we need to take care of the following 9 factors. Number 1, proper planning of the message for effective communication. Number 2, understanding the information needs of the audience. Number 3, the media access of the audience. Number 4, socio-economic conditions of the audience, because in terms of socio-economic conditions, we've already discussed about how education and literacy becomes a barrier in terms of communication. Lack of education or illiteracy becomes a barrier in terms of communication. And analysis of the various media which are available, which media is effective, in what kind of a context. We need to have specific information so that we can go about using that media. And it's important. Another important factor is setting up objectives of communication. What is the purpose of communication? Why are we communicating? And what is the message you want to give? Prepare a plan of action. In terms of plan of action, what is the media which needs to be used? What kind of audience we are communicating? And what is the message planning we are doing for communication purposes? And then implementation of the plan. The implementation of the plan would mean that you have a message. How do you go about disseminating that message? Which channel you want to use for that message? What kind of audience you are using for that message becomes important. And the very crucial and significant factor is to find out evaluation of the message and the media. Evaluation of the message and the media would mean how much of message has been understood, how effective we have been in terms of communicating that message, And evaluation of media would mean what kind of media has been effective. And we should go about using next time perhaps the same media, because that media has been effective in terms of communication. Let us also look at now, why does sometimes communication does not take place. In addition to the barriers we have identified so far, there are some more barriers to communication, which I would like to explain as semantic problems. Problems of language are called semantic barriers. There are different kinds of languages in India. How do we go about communicating in which kind of a language? In what kind of a language? Communication should be language specific. The second barrier is in terms of badly expressed message. The message does not have clarity, the message does not have precision. That is where the audience would not be in a position to understand. We must also ensure, in a country like ours, sometimes we prepare message in Hindi and we translate into other languages. Translation becomes a problem. We must try to ensure that the translation also has got the same ideas, same facts, same opinion, same feeling. We must use exactly the same word for communication. One of the important factors in terms of communication is there should not be any assumptions. If you have assumptions in communication, you don't have an open mind in terms of communication. Many of them do not have an open mind in terms of communication. When you are communicating, we must try to ensure people have certain prejudices and certain biases. When we are talking about a semantic problem, we also need to identify jargon language. We must try to ensure that there is no technical jargon in our communication. We must try to make communication very, very simple, try to use simple terminology, try to use simple words in terms of communication. There are also some personal barriers. Attitude becomes important. Some of them do not have the attitude to learn or attitude to listen, or some of them do not have an open mind. That becomes a problem. And we should also ensure, because the whole purpose of communication is to change attitude. Attitudes are complexes. Different people have different kinds of attitudes, and we must try to ensure that doesn't become a barrier in terms of communication, so that we can go about planning communication so that we can cater to them effectively, taking different kinds of attitudes and temperaments into consideration. One of the factors in terms of communication is we should not, all of us have prejudices, all of us have got biases. In the process of communication, we must try to eliminate those kind of prejudices and biases. Very, very commonly experienced barriers in communication. Let me list out. Noise in communication. We have borrowed this term for physics. In communication, we say noise. Because if two people are speaking simultaneously, or if you are speaking in a microphone, if there is some kind of a disturbance there, we call that as noise in communication. Then noise in communication becomes a barrier. Lack of planning is a barrier in terms of communication. Wrong communication, unclear communication becomes a barrier in communication. Semantic problem, cultural barriers, socio-psychological barriers, emotions, selective perception. All of us understand messages selectively. Selective perception is also a barrier. The human mind tends to be selective sometimes, and that becomes a barrier to communication. Information overload, loss by transmission. In the channel there is some disturbance. The way the message has been transmitted, then it leads to barriers in communication. Poor retention, poor listening, offensive style, very aggressive style. People are not willing to listen to a message, if there is an aggressive style. Some of the barriers in terms of communication can be attributed to lack of planning, vagueness about the goals and purpose of communication, misunderstanding of the message because of choice of wrong language, wrong word, that results in misunderstanding, and wrong choices of the channel. If you do not select a proper channel, proper media, that also becomes a barrier to communication. There are some kind of problems which are specific to the receivers. Let us try to identify what are the problems of the receiver in terms of barriers to communication. Poor listening, inattention, mistrust of the communicator, lack of interest. We're all the time evaluating what the communicator is saying. In that process, that becomes premature evaluation. Sometimes audience are not in a physical fit. They may be running temperature, they may be having fever, it may be too cold. They will not be in a position to assimilate the message. They will not be in a position to understand. The physical factors also need to be taken into consideration. We are going to be explaining some more barriers to communication, because we need to have a comprehensive understanding about various barriers to communication. Let me now identify 14 commonly accepted on the basis of some research which has been carried out in this country as barriers to communication. Badly expressed messages. Number 2, loss in transmission. Number 3, poor retention. 4, inattentive listening. 5, tendency to evaluate. 6, differences in interests and attitudes, conflicting information. 8, semantic problems. 9, over communication. 10, differing status position. Status also becomes a factor in terms of a barrier to communication. 11, prejudices. 12, I attitude, the ego problem, that I know everything. 13, resistance to change. 14, audience tend to be argumentative. Let me explain what do I mean by the various barriers which I've identified as problems to communication. Badly expressed message. What do we mean by badly expressed message? Improper formulation of message leads to misunderstanding, because we have not paid attention to in terms of the nature of language which we need to use it. We have not used the right kind of words. That becomes badly expressed message. Second, loss in transmission. Ineffective transmission channels, such as, for example, speaking on the telephone or speaking in microphone. If there is some kind of a disturbance, that becomes loss in transmission. Poor retention. Inability to retain information which we are given. There are various reasons why poor retention takes place. Maybe because we have given them overloaded information. Maybe we have not given them the right kind of information, a relevant kind of information. Poor retention is there. The other factor, the inattentive listening. Some of them do not pay attention in terms of listening. We should know that as a barrier to communication. Tendency to evaluate. All the time, the audience are evaluating the spoken content. He is evaluating the message he is trying to give. In the process, concentration gets lost. Conflicting interests and attitudes. Different kinds of people have different kinds of interest and attitude. They may not pay attention to, the communication which you are giving does not interest them. Then conflicting information. There is contradiction in information. The information which you have given yesterday and the information we are giving today, there is a conflict. Information which has been given in one channel is different with that of another channel or another media. Then there is a conflict of information. Semantic problems. Misunderstanding due to semantics because of language. Language comprehension is not there. The language level is not there. We are using difficult words in terms of communication. Then, it becomes a semantic problem. Information load, over communication. We are giving more and more information than required. Then it becomes a barrier to communication. Prejudices, because there are biases. All of us have prejudices and biases. And the purpose of communication is to see that we overcome those prejudices and biases. The whole attitude about I attitude, the ego problem of individuals, the ego problem of some of the target audience. In communication, it's not a question of I. Communication to be effective, we need to see that there is participation in communication. Resistance to change. Change is a process of life. Change is a continuous process. One has to accept change. But there are no audience who resist change relating to any kind of innovation. Refuting and arguing. All the time, there are some audience who are argumentative. They are not willing to listen to the other point of view. In communication, we are trying to ensure that our point of view is accepted. So we have talked in greater detail what are the major barriers in terms of communication. There are cultural barriers, there are linguistic barriers, there are language barriers. Illiteracy becomes a barrier. Their socio-economic conditions become a barrier. So if we can, understand, the various issues, the various problems, we have identified as barriers of communication, our communication can be more effective, more meaningful. The whole purpose of communication is to motivate people. The purpose of communication is to change attitudes of people. The purpose of communication is to see that they accept our message. The purpose of communication is not only to create knowledge and awareness. The purpose of communication is to adapt the message. If we can take some of the factors we have identified as barriers to communication, communication will be successful, communication will be effective and meaningful to the target audience. To summarize whatever we discussed so far, there are many barriers to or obstacles to communication. We have identified them as language problems. We have identified literacy as a barrier. We have identified socio-economic conditions as a barrier. We have identified communication problems. We have identified inadequate access to all media of communication. If we can take the various factors which we have discussed, we can certainly overcome barriers to communication. When we are communicating, we need to keep the various factors which we have discussed so that we can overcome many of the barriers or hurdles or challenges to communication. The ultimate purpose of communication is to bring about behavioral change and attitude. The purpose of communication is to see people adopt and apply the messages which we have disseminated. The purpose of communication is to bring about innovation and change.